Welcome, everyone. We will be getting started shortly.
While folks are coming in, I'm going to go ahead and put the link to the slides in the chat. That way, if anybody would like to follow along or make a copy, you're welcome to do that.
Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. My name is Layla Lester. I am going to be helping with all the technology with this session. So if you have any questions regarding technology, you can send me a message in the chat. Excuse me. Welcome to this session, which is supporting the UDL mindset shift in educator. I want to remind everyone that live captions are available. So if you click the CC on the bottom panel of your Zoom window, you'll be able to see those. Please mute your mic when you're not speaking. We'll really hope that you'll join us with your camera on. But we also understand that if that is not an option for you, that is okay. Please note that we are recording. So if you want to shut off your camera at any point, you can do that as well. You can do that by clicking the camera at the bottom left of your screen. If you can click on the chat window where we'll hope you'll be able to contribute throughout. You can use the drop down box above the empty box to select the recipients of your chat. So if it's something technology related, you can send a message directly to me. But we really hope that you'll have a conversation with everyone who is in this session by changing that to everyone. And so we can really get some good dialogue going on. And with that, I am thrilled to introduce our facilitators for this session. We have Jennifer. And actually, Jennifer, I did not ask you how to pronounce your last name, so I'll let you say it.
It's rough. I understand. Listen, my maiden name was right, so Pusateri is a little rough. But welcome, everybody. I'm going to invite you to go ahead and mute your microphone for now. There will be a time later when we're able to unmute that. And so if you, either Layla or whoever else is hosting, if you want to go through and just make sure folks are muted, you should be able to individually mute people in the participants window. So we'll make sure everybody gets muted real quick.
Sorry, Jennifer, now you have to unmute yourself as well.
No worries. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen, and I am coming to you live today from the Tucson airport, which is exciting. I'm on my way back from doing a workshop with CAST. So let's see. Share screen, we'll share this one. All right. So welcome. We're going to get started today, and we're going to talk a lot about this UDL mindset shift with teachers and kind of how we can scaffold that for our educators and help with that process. So I did want to introduce myself quickly. My name is Jennifer Pusateri. Currently, I work for the University of Kentucky, where I am the Universal Design Consultant. That means I help teach professors how to teach using UDL. Prior to that, I was at the Kentucky Department of Education, where I was a UDL and differentiation specialist. And before that, I was a classroom teacher, or a teacher rather, at a school for students with specific learning disabilities, grades K through 8 in Louisville, Kentucky. And that school was amazing and used a lot of the same principles of UDL in helping to teach students who learn differently. I'm also a member of my local school board, which it's been interesting. This is a learning process, we'll say. And currently, I'm also a member of the CAST National Faculty. So I get to go out and do workshops like I was able to do this week in Tucson with schools, departments of education, universities, colleges all over the United States. And I love that work. So as always, we've got some goals for our session today. Today we'll be discovering these ideas about UDL, and that they really, in order for implementation to occur, it really requires these two pieces of a mindset shift and also the methods to be able to implement UDL. We're going to also be looking at some step-by-step processes of how you can help folks shift their mindset toward one for UDL. And then finally, we'll be looking at developing this clearer view of our classrooms, because we're looking at it through the point of view of our students. So I'd like to invite you to take just a moment and think about, what are your goals for today's workshop? You know, when you came to this session, what are you hoping to get out of it? So take a moment. You can add that to the chat box if you would like. You can jot that down somewhere else. If you are in a room with other folks, feel free to share that out loud with the people in your room. But really think about, what are your goals? What are you hoping to get out of today's workshop? And while folks are doing that, Layla, I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, one more time to put the slides in the chat. I know we've had a couple of folks pop in here. I see some people are adding some ideas to the chat, some goals for today. Oh, I see some, Kelly McBride mentioned UDL, but also aligning with the QM, the Quality Matters rubric, which is really important. That's a rubric that people who design online learning often use, and it actually pairs really nicely with UDL. Great, so keep adding those into the chat box. Feel free to continue jotting those down around you. I'm gonna move right on. So the first thing I want to just make sure everybody knows, and I'm sure you already kind of know this, is that UDL is a journey. So you can see in the image on this on the screen, we've got 3 different people that are all making their own path, their own way to get to the top of this UDL mountain. And so in my experience, when we introduce educators to UDL, I found that a lot of people don't just jump right into UDL implementation. Now I did, because I'm an impulsive person, but not everybody does that. And sometimes our teachers really need to have some strategies or some ways to be more confident about using UDL, and it takes time. It's a process. But I really do believe that there's a specific period in a teacher's development of using UDL where it's crucial that they find the methods that they need to be able to do UDL in their classroom, and also that they have had that UDL mindset shift. And so we're going to dig into that here in just one moment. So this idea of having sort of different periods of development within your learning about and using UDL is not new. This is actually the image that you see on the screen is from the UDL progression rubric, which is linked. So if you have the slides open and you want to check out the link to that, that's the image is linked, and also the title of the slide is linked. And so this is created by Katie Novak and Christian Rodriguez, and this will show you kind of what does it look like at these different stages of emerging, of being a proficient educator toward UDL, and also progressing toward expert practice. And so I love how they've laid this out, and they give you, I think all the checkpoints are there. And so it shows you what an emerging teacher might look like when it comes to, for this one, for example, for guiding appropriate goal setting. So what an emerging teacher might be looking like, what their classroom might feel like in that setting, what a proficient educator who's using UDL might be doing whenever they're guiding appropriate goal setting, et cetera. And I love this rubric. I love how they've laid it out. I think it makes it really useful for a lot of teachers. But I have found that there are some folks who really are, they like the idea of UDL, and they're kind of bought in, but they're not quite to the emerging stage yet, right? They haven't really dipped their toe in yet. So I have added a couple different things to this, to the progression rubric that Katie Novak and Christian Rodriguez already created. So you can see I've added some on the left side, and I've made this name up. This is not like a fancy research name. I just made it up. The UDL Teacher Development Continuum. So you can see on the left side, before we get to emergent, proficient, and moving toward expert, I've got 3 other stages. And so those 3 other stages are skeptical teacher, a teacher who's cautiously hopeful about UDL, and then a teacher who's maybe exploratory, willing to dip their toe in. And so a skeptical teacher is somebody who maybe understands the idea of UDL, but for some reason feels that maybe this is not really for them, or maybe they feel like they don't need it. I will say a skeptical teacher is pretty hard to convince that UDL is useful. It's not impossible, but it can be a little bit difficult. But when you get into these teachers that are in the cautiously hopeful and exploratory and emergent periods, I really feel like those are the critical period where if teachers don't get the support they need during that developmental time, as they're starting to learn about using UDL, a lot of times they get overwhelmed and they turn away from UDL completely. And so what we can do on our end is we can really help to support those educators in their development of UDL. So I've really found that there are these two main pieces that have to be in place in order for teachers to use and implement and continue to use and implement UDL in their classrooms. That's a mindset. So there's a mindset shift that occurs with UDL. And then there's also, they need to have the methods to be able to do these things in their classroom. And so another way to think about this, the mindset is really kind of the theory behind UDL, and the methods are the practice. And so what I've seen is that if teachers have a UDL mindset, they're bought into this idea of UDL, but they really don't have the practical strategies, lesson planning ideas or approaches, then what happens is they get frustrated. They want to do this thing, but they just don't know how to do it. So a lot of times they give up. And then on the other hand, if teachers have the methods, like let's say they went to a PD or something and learned about UDL and learned how to plan for lessons and design lessons for UDL, but they've not had that mindset shift, meaning that they don't really fully believe that the barrier is in the environment instead of being in the student. Well, then what happens is they just end up thinking, okay, this is just another thing, right? Like UDL is just another initiative and it'll pass. So we really do need these two pieces in order for implementation of UDL to stick with our teachers. So I wanted to just take a moment and pause, and I would love to hear from you all in the chat box, or if you're willing, it's always okay to unmute for just one moment and share out loud with the group. But I'd love to hear, like, where have you seen this? Have you seen teachers who have had this change in their mindset with UDL, but just don't have the tools they need, the methods, if you will, or the other way around? Have you seen teachers who maybe have learned some of the methods behind UDL, but haven't really had that mindset shift? So what are some of the things that you all have seen? Where have you seen this idea play out in your teaching and in your work with UDL? So allow you to add something in the chat if you'd like, or unmute.
I've Daryl Hutchins from California. I've seen a common complaint that teachers have this mindset, like, yes, this makes sense, and then they go back to their classroom, 30 students with a curriculum that's moving very quickly forward, and they don't have the ability to really enact it into their classroom.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common. I appreciate you sharing that. Got several people that are sharing in the chat as well. Sometimes UDL can look like, I don't have time for this, right? Like, this is too many things. I can't handle all of this. Or some, or I love how Josh says, some sort of new idea, using quote fingers, new idea that the administration has come up with. Some other folks are talking about kind of this one and done idea that we get a lot of times with UDL PDs. Had a teacher say that UDL wouldn't really work well for their high kids and low kids. I'm again using quote fingers when I'm talking about that. Yeah. These are great. Oh my gosh. If you all don't have the chat open up the chat and read the things. I have mine on a separate iPad, so that's why I'm looking over here to the side. Yeah, I don't know if it's P Sparks or PS Parks, but either way, like you mentioned that it's difficult to use UDL with a scripted curriculum. And although it absolutely is, it's not impossible. And I think there are some folks who have really had some success with that. So keep adding your thoughts there in the chat box if you'd like, and I'll pause for just one more moment in case anyone else would like to share out loud. I see this one. The last thing that I'm seeing in the chat right now is this fear of letting go and letting students take charge. Yes, yes. I think that's such a big piece. That's such a big part of UDL is, are you willing to let go of a little bit of the control in the classroom and see what the students are able to do? I mean, that's really scary, right? Like, that's a really scary thought. So let's move forward. Please keep adding your thoughts in the chat box. I love to read those, and I'll come back later and definitely take a look at those as well. So we know that we need these two things, this mindset shift, the UDL mindset shift, and they need the methods or the practical ways to be able to implement UDL. So how can we do that? How can we help support folks? So I've tried to lay this out in a way that that we can take a step-by-step approach to helping with a mindset. I mean, it's really hard to like get into someone's brain and make them believe a thing, right? But there are other organizations and structures out in the world that do something like this, that help people shift their way of thinking. And so I've used some of those to develop this sort of 6-step process. And so the first 4 steps are really focused on that mindset shift. The last 2 steps are really giving you the methods, the practical things that you need in order to be able to design UDL instruction. And so whenever we can take teachers through this process, it's really helpful for them because they're getting both of those pieces that they really need. So what we're going to do for the remainder of our time today is we're going to go through each of the steps, and I'm going to give you some examples of how you could go about doing this. So step 1 is coming to terms with the fact that your instruction and classroom environment might be more effective for some folks than for others. And so this can be a hard sell for some teachers, right? I think we all want to believe that we're reaching all of the students in our classroom, but sometimes that can be a little tricky. So for this step 1, we can really use really some data or some other ideas. We can use some outside information to tell us how well we're working in our classroom for different groups of learners. And so we can look at some of the data that we get just as part of the teaching and learning process in our schools. We can get feedback, or maybe feedback from observations of other teachers, maybe our instructional coaches, other folks in our buildings. And they can give us some of that feedback. We can also, teachers can also video themselves teaching, and they don't have to show anybody else, because I know it's super cringy to watch yourself on video. I totally know. But you can go back and watch that video, and you can see how you interact with students. And are you staying at the front of the classroom most of the time? Do you ever venture out into the actual student seating areas? Is your classroom set up so that you can circulate really well? Are you answering or taking more questions from males and females? Are you taking more questions or answers from students of color or white students? Like who are you really working the best with in your class? And I think what we'll see as you start to look at this information, we'll find that really not all students' needs are being met. And that's okay. Like everyone is at this place, right? Like no one is meeting every single need of every student in their class, but we can always be working toward removing more barriers for our students in our classes. So some other things we can do is ask ourselves, what kind of students have typically been successful in your class? Thinking back historically over the years that you've been in the classroom, what kind of students have typically been unsuccessful in your class? Are there characteristics of those students? And then another way to think about this is, what are the student success prerequisites in your class? And so let me show you what I mean. So every class, every subject, every teacher, they have certain things that they are assuming their students can do. And so these are just some of the areas that could be prerequisite skills. And I'm going to break a couple of these down a little bit further to give you a couple more ideas. So for example, if we're talking about attention and focus, to be successful in my class, do students have to be able to pay attention for more than 10 minutes at a time? Do they have to be able to tune out distractions? Do they have to be able to sit still for more than 10 minutes? Do they have to complete a task they find uninteresting? And so in some classes, those things are real. And in some classes, that's not necessarily part of it, right? Reading and writing, here's just some other things about reading and writing. Do students have to be able to read on grade level in my class? Do they have to be able to write on grade level in my class, speak English proficiently, write in English proficiently? There are probably a lot of other different ideas that you can add in there with reading and writing or attention and focus that might be things we really expect students to be able to do in our class. And here are some other examples of things about like mobility and fine motor skills. So one of the things I taught was art. And so, I'm going to go back one slide. We didn't do a lot of reading and writing really in my class. We were constantly making things. But when it comes to these things, yeah, I really do need students to be able to use their hands, grasp or pick up or hold items, or regulate the intensity of their grip. Those are some things that I am expecting students to do in my class. And so what this does, this is not about making teachers feel bad about themselves or the work that they're doing in their class, but this helps us to really think about what are the assumptions I'm making about my students, and what are the kind of requirements that I'm asking them to have in order to be successful in my class? Because some students can't regulate the intensity of their grip, right? So does that mean that they don't get to participate in my class? Well, maybe I need to think about that. Maybe I've got a barrier there that I hadn't considered before. So I want us to think a little bit further about this idea of these prerequisite skills. What are these things that we are kind of requiring students to do to be successful in our class that maybe we hadn't considered before? So these are, I think these are 12 different kind of big areas. And then you saw how I broke some of those down, right? I broke down attention and focus and reading and writing, and what was the other one? Mobility and fine motor skills. So think about your classroom area, whatever it was that you teach or taught. What are some of the prerequisite skills that are really required for students to be successful in your class? So let's take a few moments, share those ideas in the chat box. If you want to unmute and share out loud, we can do that. I'd love to hear. I'll mute for a moment so folks. So I'm seeing some folks have added some ideas in the chat box, talking about things like organization, time management, paying attention for longer intervals of time, taking notes and studying for tests. Like, everybody doesn't know how to do that very well, right? More time management, creativity, problem solving. How to ask for help from a peer and from an adult. That's a really good one. Got motivation, positive self-talk, yes. Executive functioning skills. Got some more mobility and fine motor skills, social emotional skills and communication. Yes. Influences of mental health concerns. These are great, you all. Yeah, basic computer navigation, right? We just assume that, okay, these kids have grown up with phones in their hands and iPads and such, like they know how to do this, but not necessarily. I mean, at my level, at the college level, we have plenty of students who don't really know what they're doing when it comes to using a learning management system like Canvas or Moodle or whatever. They're not really sure how to navigate that, but we don't always stop to tell them. Normalizing this idea of coming back from being off track. Like, how do you get yourself back on track and focus back up? Yes, these are great. And so I think sometimes teachers don't think about these prerequisite skills that we have students do in our class. They maybe just haven't thought about that. I know I hadn't, honestly. And so it's really useful to think through each of those. So the second step, after we've kind of thought about our class and what kinds of students have been successful and what kinds of students have not been successful in our class, the second step is where we're really taking an inventory of our teaching and learning environment. And so what we can do is we think about this actually in the same idea as someone who has a store, like a retail store. If you have a retail store, certain periods through the year, you take an inventory, right? You go through and you determine how many do I have of this item and how many do I have of this item? And are there items in this section that are broken that I need to get rid of? Are there things here that aren't working that I might need to get rid of? And so in doing that and making this thorough inventory of a retail environment, they're then able to make decisions about what they need going forward, what things are not working that they can get rid of. And so we can do the same thing in our classroom environment, teaching and learning environment. So there are several ways to go through and do this. One way is to think about our classroom. Well, not one way. The way really is to think about it through a student lens. And so we can think about a couple different aspects. One of those being, how much am I asking students to be passively listening in my class? And how much am I asking them to do things that are active and be active with their learning and the learning process? and comparing those and really visually laying those out. What does that look like in my class? We can also take an inventory of our instructional and teaching preferences. I think a lot of us have those, right? There's certain things that I really, really like to do in my class, and that might work for some students, but it may not work for others. We can also take a look at our physical space in our classroom. Is the classroom set up in order to help support students working together, or is it more set up to be focused straight ahead on me, the teacher? And there are different reasons for both of those things. So if we wanted to do something like an inventory of our instructional and teaching preferences, we can break this down by thinking about how we deliver information. How do we deliver content to our students? We can also think about how do we ask students to show what they know. So for this example, we would think about how we are asking students to, how we're delivering content to students. So you can think about it percentage wise. So about what percentage of the time are students doing independent reading in your class in order to get new information? And so I would suggest that folks fill in the blanks over here and think about, okay, about 10% of the time students are doing independent reading. Me reading to students, that might be about 15% of the time. And so a teacher could go through and just kind of determine, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like I really like doing examples or demonstrations in my class. So that might be a big chunk of my pie. And honestly, there's no right or wrong answer here. This is really just going through and trying to find what am I currently doing? What's my inventory of my classroom? That way I know where to start. I know what things maybe I can determine what things will be working well and what things maybe not are not working well. And that gives me some room to maybe get rid of some ideas and move some new ones in, considering what barriers I need to remove from my students. Another way to do that is to make a visual depiction of your teaching space, the physical space where you are doing teaching. Now, if you're doing this in an online setting, you could take a screenshot of maybe your Canvas course or your Moodle course and try and figure out where am I asking students to go? How many clicks does it take to get to the assignment that they need to find? You can ask somebody else who is totally outside of your class, like maybe a spouse or a child or a partner, to come and try to navigate your online course and see how that goes. Ask them to find something that you expect students to find and see how they're able to do that. If it's taking them a lot of work to get there, or if it's something they can easily find. And when we're thinking about our physical teaching space, once we've kind of laid out what it looks like in our classroom, generally, I like to use an aerial view because it just helps me to picture that space, but there are lots of ways you could do that. What I might do then is come in and I might color different areas. I might use different areas to color code. Where do I spend most of my time? Do I spend most of my time at the front of the room by the board? Am I back in the student chair desks area? Am I at my computer desk or my teacher desk? And I might use a certain color to show where I spend most of my time. And then I might consider, are there certain areas of this classroom space where we have some issues with students moving around, right? Like, for example, have I put the pencil sharpener in the trash can in a very visual part of the classroom where everybody sees it? So like every time somebody's got to sharpen a pencil, they're coming up by the board and distracting other students while I'm trying to talk or lecture or teach or whatever. So there are ways that we can think about where are the pain points in my classroom physically. The same thing for online spaces. And how can I remove those barriers or mitigate those issues in my classroom? So once we've taken a pretty thorough and honest inventory, and again, it's not a blame game. It's really you're looking for the facts. You're trying to find the facts. So after we've done that, our step 3 is acknowledge the power you have as a lesson designer and accept the charge to design lessons that enable all students to succeed. So I'm reminded of this idea, and this is actually a fairly famous prayer. And so the prayer says, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now, I don't care necessarily to whom you pray or choose to not pray. That doesn't matter. What the idea behind this is that there are things within our sphere of influence and there are things that are not in our sphere of influence. And so what's helpful is for us to be able to determine which are the things I actually have some control over in my classroom and which are some of the things that I don't. And so one thing we can do, and we're going to do this as sort of a chat box brainstorm, I would love to hear from you all. What are some things in the classroom and the teaching environment that we just can't change? Like we don't have the power to change as teachers. So throw some ideas in there. And I want to see what people come up with. Again, you're also welcome to unmute and share out loud with a group if you would like. Class sizes, absolutely. Standards, what students bring to the classroom. And of course, that would have to do with their experiences outside the class. Scripted curriculum, required curriculum, yes. The size of the space, right? I don't usually get to pick that as a teacher. The hours of the day, standardized tests. What happens at home, right? So many of these things are outside of our control. Yeah, the mix of students in my class, the makeup of the class. Kelly says, oh, the space is awful. The classroom space is awful. Yeah, and I know COVID just made that worse when we had to socially distance in classrooms, right? Like we just felt more crowded. Parent engagement in student learning. Yeah, there's not a lot we can do about that necessarily. Interruptions to the schedule. Yeah, some teachers, Erin mentions that some teachers don't have a classroom space. They move on a cart from room to room. Absolutely. Tuition, yes. Changes in the environment. Heck, COVID can go in there, right? We've got a lot of things. And so it can become a little overwhelming when we start thinking about all of these things that are outside of our control. But then the next part of this step is to really look at, okay, well, what do I have the power to change? What do I have the power to remove in my classroom? What barriers can I remove for students? So let's start a new list. So now our new chat box brainstorm are, what are some of the things that I have the power to change in my classroom and my school? Kelly says my attitude. Yes, absolutely. Voice and choice. We got a +1 for Kelly. And again, you're welcome to unmute and chat if you feel comfortable. Yeah, how I evaluate students. How do I structure lessons? Depending on the district, of course, how you deliver content. Am I providing options? Oh my gosh, y'all are typing so fast. This is great. Attitude to providing urgency and agency. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about kind of looking at your attitude and how that impacts your classroom. Alternate ways to access the curriculum. How students are positioned. How we communicate with students, opportunities to express themselves, personal mindset. Yeah, and I was also thinking about this idea of what counts and what doesn't count in my classroom. Does reading count if you're listening to an audio version? And have you made that clear to students? So, even things like that, right? Course learning outcomes in some places, yeah, in some cases you can change those. You can make those things that you have the power to change. So what this step really is doing is it's saying, there's so many things that there's not a lot I can do to change. Some of those things I can remove some barriers to make it a little bit easier. However, there are a lot of things I do have the power to change in my classroom. And I often have found that when teachers make those changes that they are able to change, the way they're teaching, their mindset, their attitude, how they interact with students, how they interact with families, all of those things and more, when they start to change those things, sometimes the things that they don't actually have the power to change end up changing anyway. So our last step in the mindset chunk, if you will, is this is where we really come to believe and we accept that using a UDL mindset and shifting to a UDL mindset, and again, a UDL mindset just means that we believe that the barrier is in the environment or the design, but not in the student. That's really the kind of the crux of the shift to a UDL mindset. And so we believe that using a UDL mindset is going to empower us to design instruction that allows all learners to be successful. And so the way that I would suggest folks do this is by reviewing the things that they have found in the first 3 steps. Take a look at your physical layout of your classroom. Take a look to see approximately what percentage of the time are you asking students to sit quietly and receive information in your class versus, how often are they allowed to be active, and are you encouraging them to be active in their learning? And after you've kind of reviewed the things that you've found for those first 3 steps, this is where we really make this conscious decision to shift ourselves to a UDL mindset. It's almost like saying it out loud, right? So we start, after we finish with this particular step, this is where we're really going to start digging into the practical aspects. So I want to take a pause right here. because I've talked for a long time and I don't like talking for a long time. So I want to ask in the chat box, what's resonating with you so far? What questions do you have? And what ideas do you have to share? Other ways that we can think about shifting mindsets. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are in the chat, or unmute if you would like. Dr. Fitzgerald's "Does it hurt enough to change?" quote. Oh, love. Yeah, you're right. It absolutely has to hurt enough to change. Love that book. And so Rachel says, yeah, another sell is that, and this can be to faculty, this can be to teachers, that when you're shifting the design in this way, it's going to end up saving them time in the long run, right?
Jennifer, this is Kelly. So
Kelly.
I teach composition English at a two-year college, but I also have a degree in instructional design. And I found that there are a lot of things I know that go into making a really great, fancy design, but sometimes the theory does not match UDL. And so, you know, I just a few years ago just started doing in my LMS just every week, week one, and then just a bulletin Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then this is what we're doing Monday, and then links directly in that box to handouts, to assessments, to folders, whatever, instead of like having all these sub boxes and fancy design. And my student evaluations in terms of their happiness with the class went up like crazy. Yeah. It wasn't that my previous design was bad, but my students come in with very little technical knowledge, very small opportunities to access the internet. I teach some of the 5 most rural, poor counties in Oklahoma. And so I had to make that adaptation, even though I had spent a lot of time designing these courses. That was part of my PhD work, was doing all these things. I just went back to the basics, and because it's not about me, it's not about what I know about design, it's what my students need, in a way that even the ones that do have that ability, do have that access, it's not going to be so elementary to them that it irritates them. But the ones that come in and don't have that knowledge, it's going to be very accessible to them. And so that's one thing I think we get all involved in, oh, I know how to do this, I know how to design it. But sometimes we just need to take it back to the very most simplest things. So
I love that. I love that. And I totally agree. And I think this is where the theme of our conference comes back into play. I mean, we can ask students, is this where, and you mentioned the, you know, student evaluations, which of course are flawed in many ways, but that's okay. We can still get information from them, right? That's still a data point, but we can ask our students. So I set up my Canvas course, for example, this way this semester, because I'm trying something new. How did that work for you all? And let them tell us, and they'll tell you, like they'll let you know pretty quickly whether that's working or not. So I really appreciate that. And you're right, sometimes the things we learned might need to be changed, tweaked, modified, and actually they should be, depending on the kind of students or the students that we have in our classroom, right? We teach to the students we have, not to the students we wish we had. So, I mean, the chat box has blown up and I can't read this fast, and so I wish I could, but there's a lot of really awesome comments in here. So if you're able to open that up and take a look at those, please do. So I'm going to move forward with our last couple steps. So again, to review, steps 1 through 4 were really about shifting your mindset, getting yourself into a place where you're ready to accept that maybe some of the things that I've always held dear as a teacher are not really working for everybody, and that's okay. I'm going to take an inventory. I'm going to make some changes in my classroom, and I'm going to start moving myself to a place where I understand the power I have as a classroom and teaching designer in my class and in my school. So the next 2 steps, steps 5 and 6, this is about the methods part. This is like when you've had that mindset shift of, yes, I totally get this. UDL is the thing that I want to do. I'm buying in. Let's go. Now what do I do? And so steps 5 and 6 are really the 2 pieces that are going to help us move into the practical part of making UDL happen in our classroom. So step 5, as a result of having a UDL mindset shift, we're going to vow to seek out and reduce the learning barriers that get in between your students and their learning. So I've got 3 different approaches that I've used with a lot of teachers across the US, and they seem to be really useful in that they're laid out step by step. So there are 3 different approaches. The +1 approach, which is, they're actually in this order for a reason. So the +1 approach is a good approach if you have maybe some more reluctant teachers that are not really ready to go from 0 to 60 in their classroom, right? They might be willing to make a small change and see how that goes. That's the one for them. +1 approach is the one for them. Troubleshooting approach is a little slightly more advanced, but really helps you get at some of the problems of practice that are in all of our classrooms, and helps you to take what you see in your classroom and shift it to the things that you have control over. And then we use the UDL framework to really help us find solutions. And finally, journey mapping is probably, I would say, the most advanced of the 3. I don't know if it's advanced necessarily, but they are definitely work well in an order. And so a journey mapping approach helps to put you in the mind, in the point of view of your students as you're thinking through your teaching. So I'm going to show you, these are 3 templates that go along with each of the 3 approaches. And unfortunately, I don't have time to like show you the approaches today because there are a lot of steps involved with them. But I will give you some more information on where you can find more about that later. And so I find that it's helpful to have a visual, a place to put a thing. And I actually learned this when I taught. So I taught at a school for students with specific learning disabilities. And I found that they were much more likely to complete something if I gave them a place to put the thing. If I gave them a place to write the thing, or if I made like a placemat for them to actually put the thing. For some reason, when I give them a place to put the thing, they're more likely to do it. So I've found that using these templates, these graphic organizers really is what they are, to help scaffold the process of lesson planning for UDL, it seems to be really useful for teachers. And so again, I would love to go into that, but that's like a whole hour long. So we can't go into exactly how those work today, but I will give you information on how you can learn more about that in a second. Our final step in this process is really committing. Like we're committing now. Now I've got the mindset. Now I've got some of the tools that are going to help me to be successful. And I'm going to commit to go all in on UDL. And that's really what this last step is about. Committing to using this evidence-based planning framework that is the UDL framework to design more equitable instruction that reduces learning barriers. And then we're going to continue reflecting on that and refining that with input from our students. So there's really 2 ways that I would suggest doing that. I think my practice grew really quickly when I decided to finally like dig into the guidelines. I was sort of peripherally understanding the guidelines for a while, but when I decided, okay, you know what, I want to understand these things and I want to know, like going into a teaching situation, that I'm doing something that's evidence-based because it's on the framework. And so when I started to really dig into the guidelines and learn more about each of the 9 guidelines, each of the 31 checkpoints, I really felt like I was able to transfer that over into my practice much better than when I just sort of had this general idea that green means engagement and blue means action expression. And that wasn't really very helpful for me. And so I needed to get in there and learn about the guidelines. The other part is, now that I kind of understand the guidelines, I need some examples of strategies that might fit with the UDL guidelines. And I always like to make sure I make it clear that there is no such thing as a UDL strategy. That's not a thing. But a lot of the strategies that we already know in the teaching world will align with the UDL framework. They make sense. They should fit somewhere in the UDL framework would be my comment there. And so in order for me to get to a place where I can come up with my own strategies, it's really helpful for me to have some examples. So I would love to have these provided for our teachers. So one of the things that I would suggest is people find some strategies that work with UDL and then use those as examples. And typically, as a teacher, at least whenever I was looking for something, a strategy or a new lesson or a new idea, I would go out and Google things, but then I would see something and go, ooh, what if I did this with that thing? And I would tweak it and make it my own, right? And so I think a lot of us do that as teachers. And so once we have some examples of strategies that work, then we're able to sort of make our own and have our own ideas that would fit into that as well. So let me recap real quick. So our 6 steps that we talked about. Step 1, we recognize, hey, this might not actually be working as well as I thought. Step 2 is where we take an honest but non-blaming inventory of what we're currently doing in our classroom. Step 3 is where we accept that we actually have the power to change a lot of things that go on in our classroom just based on what we can have control over. And then finally, 4, we accept that change is possible and that we're willing to give this a shot. So that's our mindset shift. The last 2 steps, those are our where we're getting the methods that we need in order to be able to do the things that are UDL. And so that's where we're seeking out the barriers to engage all learners. And that would be maybe using something like lesson planning templates. And those 3 are not the only way to plan lessons with UDL, right? Those are just 3 that I have happened to use that seem to work well for teachers. And then finally, after we've got the mindset, we've got some methods that are going to work, we're going to really go all in. And so step 6 is where we commit to designing equitable instruction for our students by learning more about the UDL framework, getting into those guidelines and checkpoints and really understanding what they're about. And then also starting to equate the strategies that we maybe already know and use and finding where those align and overlap with the UDL guidelines. So those are our 6 strategies. So I actually have a book coming out, which is crazy talk. If you would tell my like 6th grade language arts teacher that I had a book coming out, she would not believe you. But this is coming out very soon. You can actually go on and pre-order if you would like. And so the book is called Transform Your Teaching. And if you're on Twitter, feel free to just follow me on Twitter so that you can get some updates about when that's available, when the print copy should be coming out. But I wanted to show you some how the things we talked about today align with what's in this book. So the first half of the book, well, the first chunk of the book, we'll say, is really about the mindset shift that we talked about. And so there are multiple exercises in there that help walk teachers through step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. There are a lot of visuals. There are a lot of places for teachers to write out or craft their own answers. There should be a lot of room around the margins for people to add their own notes if they would like. That's something I love to do. But that first part is really a workbook, and it scaffolds that process of going from a place of thinking that the barrier or the problem in my classroom is with the student to really looking at it honestly and being like, well, no, I think maybe there's a lot I can do on my end to change the environment. And that is in fact where the barriers have been. So that's what that first part is about. Sarah, I will put that in there in just 1 second. I'll put it in the chat box. The second part is those 3 methods that I talked about, or 3 approaches, if you will, for lesson planning. And so you get the templates. There are examples in there for elementary and middle school. And then there's also a blank template that you can also copy and use. And so it takes you through a step-by-step how you might use something like this in your classroom setting. Oh, thanks, Brian. And so you can see on the right side, that's an example of what the step-by-step instructions might look like for that one goes along with the troubleshooting approach. And so there's like a what to do, here's some tips and tricks, and here's an example. And so each of these takes an example, a classroom example, and works it through the whole approach so you can kind of get a feel for how that works out. So that's really the first 4, the mindset part was the first 4 steps. The lesson planning ideas and approaches were the step 5. And so step 6 is also part of the book as well. And so there's a description of each of the guidelines and each of the checkpoints. There's 31 checkpoints in the UDL framework. And so I think it's really helpful to have an understanding of each of the checkpoints and kind of how they fit within the guidelines. So I've tried to make something that is just an easy explanation or an example of these checkpoints and how they might play out in a classroom setting so that you can get a good idea of what those are about. And then the other part is there are some strategies, usually 2 or 3 strategies for each checkpoint, so that you can get an idea, a practical idea of how those checkpoints play out in the classroom. So you've got the descriptions, and then you also have the strategies as part of that book as well. So I'll put that back up there. There's my Twitter handle. And I'm going to pause just for a moment or 2. Let me make sure. Yeah. I think you did. They put the link in the chat box. Thank you so much. If you want to pre-order the book, that is in there. I believe the print comes out on September 20th. And so we've got about 5 or 10 minutes left. I wanted to see if there are questions, comments, concerns, ideas that folks would like to throw out, because I don't have all the answers, but you know, as a group, we've got a lot of good answers together. So what are some questions, comments, concerns, or ideas that folks would like to share? You can unmute and share out loud. You're also welcome to add ideas in the chat box.
Hi, Jennifer. I have a question for you.
Mhm.
I know there's a few of us here that are teaching at the post-secondary level.
Mhm.
Other than encouraging our faculty to revise or reconsider a lesson plan, which many of them have never held in their hands before,
Right.
how do we approach them when we're talking about looking at their course objectives differently outside of a standard lesson plan template?
That's a great question. You're right. I think, and I think a lot of my faculty would panic if I asked them for something like a lesson plan. So I appreciate that question. One of the things I found to be really useful actually with university instructors is starting with their problem that they're seeing in their classroom. Because who doesn't want to fix a problem that they're seeing in their classroom, right? And so starting with the problem, and then actually the troubleshooting approach works really well for that. So I start with the problem, and then we kind of reframe that problem into something that we have some control over in our classroom. And then we find which UDL guideline aligns with that. And then that gives us our solutions and the checkpoints. So I think that's one really good way to do that, is to just kind of start with, okay, so what is the problem that you're seeing in your classroom that you would like to address? Maybe that's attendance. Maybe it's you only have, out of a class of 100 students, 3 are the ones that are raising their hands and participating. And so, folks who are familiar with UDL would go, okay, well, yeah, I mean, the first question is about engagement. The second one is about maybe giving students different ways to respond, or different ways to have a conversation in the classroom that's not raising their hand and talking in front of 100 people, right? But instructors don't know that. So when we can help them take that question or that problem they're seeing, reframe it into something they have control over, and then give them some possible solutions for that, that seems to be really useful. Hope that helps. Layla, I don't know if you've, I'm sorry.
No, thank you for that.
Layla, I don't know if you've seen any questions that have come through the chat that I have maybe missed, but we can take a couple minutes and look at some of those.
I actually just sent you one.
Oh.
So there was a question about, is there a link to an inventory or a checklist of things that students need to do to be successful in a classroom? Kind of like for students to be able to do a self-assessment.
Oh, that's a good question. No, I hadn't thought about that. So the book is really geared toward teachers, and again, what teachers have control over. So that's really what that part is focused on, although I find that to be an interesting idea. So maybe that's something that we'll consider going forward. So thanks for the idea. I like it.
One thing I'm struck by is that learning is not linear. UDL framework really kind of opened my eyes to realizing that all of our students, all of us as adult learners, are at different points on that framework, and so I kind of love what you said, how your teaching changed when you just started applying that framework. And I think, I'm coming out of 26 years of teaching, but I wish I had that framework sooner to just look to see, with a different lens, not totally overhauling everything I'm doing, but just with that guideline as my lens to figure out where I can remove barriers for different kids. And I just, I'm really just struck by the idea that we are all in different places on those different colors, and that we are all progressing differently, and I just think that's a really powerful mindset. Somebody else kind of posted in the chat too, that it's a process mindset rather than a product mindset. And I really like that way of thinking, that it's about how you're learning, not so much as the race and not where you are in the race, but just that you are learning and progressing.
Yeah, and it's about progress too. It's not about perfection. It's about progress, right? And I don't know about y'all, but as a teacher, I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, a little bit of a control freak. And so I want to have the perfect lesson, but the thing is, I'm never going to have that. And so just to know that I'm moving toward progress and making my lessons more equitable for students is useful. I just saw a question pop up. Kevin asked a question. How do you handle the attitude that life is full of barriers and students need to learn how to overcome, and that UDL is counterproductive to that end? Yeah, I'm familiar with that attitude. I think that's a privileged question that people who are privileged ask. And I'm not saying that you're asking that question, but from the folks I've heard that from, it seems to be a privileged question. And I think one one thing we can look at is we can actually point to the research on this. And so if you look at research for things like cognitive load theory, that shows that there are different parts of cognitive load. There are parts of cognitive load, and cognitive load just meaning like the energy cost, I guess, the cognitive energy cost that something requires. And so like there are parts of cognitive load that are useful and that we want to keep, because that's a little bit of that struggle in learning is really helpful. But there are these extraneous things that are really not related to learning the thing, but are still part of it. And that's barriers. I mean, if we want to translate that over, that's what barriers are. Barriers are things that are getting in the way of the actual learning that don't actually have anything to do with the learning. So sometimes, especially if I'm working with university professors, I like to point to the research as much as possible. And that's one way that I've done that, is to kind of counteract that a little bit by, well, yeah, sure. But I mean, is making something hard for the sake of making something hard actually helping with learning? Maybe, but maybe not. Yeah, productive struggle versus useless struggle. Yeah, thanks, Michelle. That's a good way to say that. Oh, and I did want to point out too, and because obviously the theme of our conference is student voice. And so in each of the 3 lesson approaches, planning approaches, has a part where you're really turning the question back towards students and saying, here's what I think the problem is. What do you all think? Is that the problem? And then students are able to provide some input. And then after you've taught the thing or you've used the different lesson, then you come back to students and say, okay, so I tried this new thing. How did that go? Was that useful for you? Was that not useful for you? What things got in the way that I didn't maybe think of? And so these are also about really pulling students into that process. And they're the ones that we want to teach, right? So like we need to hear what they have to say. That's going to be really helpful. And we heard that if you were able to hear the keynote this morning from the panelists, you heard that in a lot of their comments. I think we maybe have time if there's one more question.
There was one more about the template that I sent you, Jennifer.
Okay. Sorry, it's going so fast. If you can find it real quick, that's probably going to be faster than me finding it.
Someone asked about the availability of the templates for the new school year.
Yeah, good question. So the print version of the book, I don't think will be out until September 20th. I don't know how else to do that. Oh, I don't know the answer to your question. If there's one specifically that you were looking at, you can email me or send me a message on Twitter and we can talk about it. See if we can get you the thing. Because you're right. I would love, the goal was to have it finished by the symposium, but unfortunately COVID got in the way. So I wish it was ready already, but it's not. Okay, well, I think we're almost at the end of our time. Thanks everybody for showing up today, and hopefully this will be something that's useful for you all and thinking about how to approach teachers and even your own teaching. And so if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or ideas, please feel free to send those my way via Twitter or email. And I look forward to seeing all of you soon. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much, Layla. Appreciate it.